Hello, this is Professor Michael Lipey, and in this narration, I am going to talk about aggression. What do I mean by aggression? Okay, so aggression is any behavior intended to harm another individual. Okay, now we can behaviors that harm that intend to harm. They don't necessarily harm, but if the intent is to harm, okay, then uh, that's aggression. Okay. Now we often talk about two forms that aggression can take, or two, shall we say, motivations behind aggression. Okay. So proactive aggression, which is also called instrumental aggression, is where aggressive behavior occurs. Okay. In as a means to a desired end. Okay, so the goal of the aggressor isn't necessarily to hurt. Okay, um, it's necessary to achieve some sort of outcome. Okay, so for example, the bully in the playground who kind of beats up on a little kid. Uh, because he wants his lunch, okay, and gets his lunch, okay, that would be proactive aggression, okay. The aggression is inflicted to get the kid's lunch, okay. um, Reactive aggression, on the other hand, as the term kind of implies, is aggression that's basically more spontaneous and more reactive, okay. And basically, this reactive aggression often occurs in moments of anger or strong emotion. The means and the end coincide. The harm is inflicted for its own sake, okay. Uh, it's so someone is in a an argument with another person, okay, and one of the persons basically uh, goes after the other person, okay, physically, okay, um, and and there is no other goal other than really to hurt the person because you're angry at the person, direct that anger at the other person, okay. Or don't forget, aggression doesn't necessarily have to be physical aggression. Okay, it can be nonverbal. Okay, it can be verbal. Okay, so for example, lashing out with insulting a person. Okay, because insulting a person um, hurts the person's feelings. Okay, but that's aggression. There were no there were no fisticuffs or anything like that, but the aggression was this verbal, insulting kind of behavior. That can be, um, is often reactive. Okay, we really want to hurt the other person's feelings. Okay, okay, so there's just keep that distinction in mind between proactive and reactive aggression. You can get the sense of it when this is kind of like forward acting. You're proactive, you're doing this, you're hurting another person to get something else, okay? Or reactive, where you're reacting to the other person and you want to harm the person. The violent crime clock, I took this down from your textbook, okay, or the Casson textbook, I should say. Um, and you can see that, 8 years ago, a lot of crime happens, okay, in our society, okay. Um, these numbers may be even more dramatic 8 years later, as we've seen somewhat of a obviously more than somewhat of an increase in crime over the past year or two. Now there's cultural variation in aggression. Okay, cultures differ. Okay, they differ with respect to the forms that the violence typically takes. Okay, uh, people have different kinds of attitudes toward various kinds of aggression is considered more acceptable. Okay, aggression in certain kinds of situations is seen depending on the culture, as more or less an okay thing or a taboo thing to do. Culture is different. We're going to see some examples of that as we push forward here. Cultures differ in aggression involving children. Okay, so whatever one might think of spanking as a form of physical punishment, uh, it's basically it is aggression because there is the intent to hurt. Okay, so almost by definition, okay, it's aggression. Okay, now the intent is to hurt. Okay, the goal is typically to you know teach the child something. Well, cultures, even in the United States, some of our uh, some ethnicities are more accepting and view spanking sort of like in a favorable light. If I have to do it, I'm going to do it because it helps me teach my child. Other, even within our society, take a much more negative view of spanking. So even within a culture, okay, subcultures within it can differ in aggression involving children. Okay, that's just one example. Some societies are known for their nonviolence. We talked about the form that violence might take. And by the way, when we use the term violence, okay, that's violence basically um, is, is aggression that basically is physical and violent. Okay, um, so not all aggression, of course, is violent. Okay, but all violence, okay, can but violence generally can be seen as a form of physical aggression. Okay. Anyways, if you look at murders across the world, okay, and we look at the extent to which they're gun related, we see really, really kind of low. Okay, this is um, homicides per 100,000 people that involve guns. Okay, and then the very familiar thing we hear about guns in our society here in the United States. Here's the United States. Okay, Chile's pretty high, but still not anywhere close to us. Okay, and then we get to these other countries. Okay, very, very little uh, amount of gun related murders. So the United States, the form of violence that is taking the United States is much more gun related, okay, than in pretty much most other cultures. Okay. Okay. So we look at culture and aggression. I mentioned bullying in the playground earlier. Well, bullying, okay, is common in virtually all cultures. Okay, in some cases, it's learned. It's usually frowned upon, but it is a form of instrumental aggression. Okay, bullying others that meant to get things out of the other person. Okay, the weaker person. Okay, so bullying occurs everywhere. Okay, not just here. Okay, um, there are a handful of societies that have nonviolent cultures. Okay, so here's an example of some. Okay, I'll leave this as something that uh, you can look at this. And look at the slides. Um, uh, the slide outlines. Okay, but you can also find this in the Castanet all text. But you have some societies where you have really almost no aggression. Okay, look at the Ladakhs, okay, in northern India. Villagers indicate they have no memory of any fighting in the village. So there you go. Okay, now what I want to do now, okay, I'm going to show you a video that Brad Bushman put together, kind of entertaining. Uh, it's animated, okay, And what Bushman will do is debunks a few myths about aggression, including um, the relative prevalence of aggression now, okay, in the world, okay, as opposed to ages past. Okay, we sometimes think, oh my God, it's so much worse, but actually, just the opposite is true. Whoops. So let's watch this. Um,
Hello, my name's Brad Bushman. I've been doing research on aggression and violence for over 25 years. Let me begin by defining the terms aggression and violence, because lay people and researchers often use the terms differently. Lay people may describe a salesperson who tries really hard to sell merchandise as aggressive. The salesperson, however, does not want to harm potential customers. Most researchers define aggression as any behavior intended to harm another person who does not want to be harmed. Lay people and researchers also use the term violent differently. A meteorologist might call a storm violent if it has intense winds, rain, thunder, lightning, or hail. Most researchers define violence as aggression that has as its goal extreme physical harm, such as injury or death. Thus, all violent acts are aggressive acts. But not all aggressive acts are violent. Only the ones designed to cause extreme physical harm are violent. It might surprise some people to learn that violence levels around the world have actually declined by millennium, by century, and by decade. These findings are described in Professor Steven Pinker's book titled The Better Angels of Our Nature: Why Violence Has Declined. Quantitative studies of body counts, such as the proportion of prehistoric skeletons with axe or arrowhead wounds, indicate that prehistoric societies were far more violent than our own. Although one can kill a lot more people with a bomb than with an axe, the death rates per battle were much higher in the past than today. Estimates show that if the wars of the 20th century had killed the same proportion of the population as ancient tribal wars, then the death toll would have been 20 times higher, 2 billion rather than 100 million. More recent data also show that violence is declining. European murder rates have decreased dramatically since the Middle Ages. Even since the middle of the 20th century, global violence has been falling steadily. The number of armed conflicts and combat deaths, the number of military coups, the number of deadly violence campaigns waged against civilians have all declined. As Pinker notes, quote, cruelty as entertainment, human sacrifice to indulge superstition, slavery as a labor-saving device, conquest as the mission statement of government, genocide as a means of acquiring real estate, torture and mutilation as routine punishment, all were common features of life for most of human history. But today, they are rare to non-existent in the West, far less common elsewhere than they used to be, concealed when they do occur, and widely condemned when they are brought to light. Close quote. Although violence rates are declining, it seems as if current levels of world violence are at an all-time high. One possible explanation for this misperception is that the news media are saturated in violent images. In the news media today, a common phrase is, if it bleeds, it leads. That is, violent, gory news stories often become the leading news stories. Citizen journalists around the world also make use of social media such as Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube to show and tell the world about unjustified acts of violence. Some individuals and groups even use social media to broadcast horrific acts of violence. Violence stories trump most other news stories. On the news, violent stories are also repeated frequently as any new information becomes available. These violent images and stories become burned into our memories. Entertainment media are also saturated with violent images. For example, our recent research shows that acts of gun violence in PG-13 movies, for viewers 13 and older, have more than tripled since 1985, the year the rating was introduced. Researchers have been studying aggression for decades. It's important to conduct research so that people don't have to rely on gut feelings, hunches, intuitions, opinions, and common sense. Research can test what beliefs are true and what beliefs are myths. For example, my own research has contradicted many myths that people believe. One common myth is that it's healthy to vent your anger and blow off steam by expressing it, such as by yelling and screaming, punching a pillow, or kicking a trash can. Research shows that this is the worst thing you can do when you're angry. It's like using gasoline to put out a fire. It only feeds the flame. Angry people are highly aroused. Their blood pressure and heart rate are elevated. Venting keeps arousal levels high. It keeps aggressive thoughts active in memory, and it keeps angry feelings strong. Research has shown that it's much better to try to reduce the arousal, such as by taking deep breaths, listening to calming music, or counting to 10. Former U.S. President Thomas Jefferson said, "If you're very angry, you should count to 100 instead." Angry people can also distract themselves or adopt a more distant perspective of the situation, like a fly on the wall. It also helps to do something incompatible with anger and aggression, such as helping someone in need, watching a comedy, kissing a lover, or petting a puppy. Another myth is that aggressive people suffer from low self-esteem. Our research has shown instead that aggressive people tend to be narcissistic. They have inflated, high self-esteem. Narcissists think they are special people who deserve special treatment, and they lash out aggressively against others when they don't get the special treatment they think they're entitled to. Another myth is that violence sells. Our research has shown that people are less likely to remember brands, have more negative attitudes towards them, and are less likely to purchase them when they are embedded in violent media than when they're embedded in non-violent media. This is probably because we are hardwired to pay attention to violent cues, based on our evolutionary past. Because humans have limited attentional capacity, if we pay attention to violent cues, we have less capacity to pay attention to the advertised brands. Like most social problems, scientific research is a promising avenue for solutions to the problems of aggression and violence.
Okay, well, okay. Yes, violence is, violent aggression is much, much, less than it was historically. Okay, we are less accepting of it. There's much, much less of it, which does not mean that there isn't considerable amount of violence and aggression in our current society. What's going on in Ukraine, okay, and the brutality with which the Russians have waged their aggression, has shocked the world. Okay, um, and one of the reasons it shocked the world is that that had become relatively rare, particularly in the northern hemisphere and in Europe. Okay, but centuries ago, that was not an uncommon. That was going on all over the place, right? Okay, all over the known world. In any case, but Bushman tells us a little bit about some myths, and we'll get back to some of those. The myth of catharsis. Interestingly, the myth of self-esteem, low self-esteem being associated with greater aggression. Actually, it's people with very high self-esteem who often referred to as narcissists, okay, who exhibit the greatest levels of aggression, particularly okay when their status or their goodness or what have you is called into question. That was another myth. We'll get to media and aggression, which there's so much. Um, and when Bushman is saying aggression um, or violence depicted in advertisements doesn't sell, um, he's right about that. On the other hand, people will go to movies, okay, and watch things on TV, not commercials and so on. Um, in some cases, the more they expect it to be violent and involve aggression. So in that sense, violence does sell, but what Bushman was referring to is that in advertisements, okay, that involve aggression, they tend to turn us off. Okay, we have more negative attitudes toward the product. Okay, and he gives this interesting idea that we've actually seen that aggression basically captures attention. Okay, violence does. Okay, and so if you include violence, okay, in your ad, okay, people are going to rivet to the violence, okay, not to information about, what you're selling or what your product is. Okay, remember we talked about way back in this class the how angry faces, okay, uh, are spontaneously picked out in a crowd. That's a good example of how, in this case, the threat, okay, of violence, an angry face, okay, basically rivets our attention. It's built into us. Okay, let's move along. So, talk about some theories about aggression and some ideas about where aggression comes from. Okay, well, there's evolutionary psychology, obviously, okay? And basically, here the emphasis is placed on, as we've seen, genetic survival rather than survival of the individual, okay? So, one aspect of, of aggression, one form that, ironically, we've seen how altruism and pro-social behavior can be honed into our genes through evolution, but aggression can and for different reasons that to the to the victor in a war go the ability to pass on one's genes. Okay, so we can kind of intuitively understand aggression being part of human nature from that evolutionary perspective. Um, but it also has some other kinds of implications. So we tend to be as humans, okay, inhibited uh, from aggressing against um, those who are genetically related to us. Okay, our siblings, our if you will, blood relatives. Okay, um, and that would make sense from an evolutionary point of view because to the extent that aggression occurred toward, okay, you know, our relatives, okay, the person's relatives, okay, that would make those genes, which are shared with the aggressor and the aggressed against share, those genes would be less likely to get passed on. So, from a point of view of evolutionary psychology, the idea that we're inhibited from aggressing, uh, we tend to feel uncomfortable and have really kind of an inhibition of aggressing against our relatives, okay, uh, basically makes sense from an evolutionary point of view, okay. Um, and generalized from that, as we've seen in previous discussions, okay, um, people that, there does tend to be an inhibition of aggression against people who are similar to one, particularly in looks, okay, but also in terms of what one knows about the other person's culture and things like that, okay. So that would be a generalization, okay, from um, inhibiting aggression against genetically related others, and there's data on that, if you will, okay. Uh, what about gender differences? Uh, So, for example, men tend to be engaged in more physical forms of aggression. Okay, um, and then do women for whom, with women, aggression tends to take the form of verbal. Okay, and other kinds of ways at getting indirectly harming another person. Okay, such as through gossip, if you will, if you think about Mean Girls. So, how are those differences explained from an evolutionary point of view? Well, aggression, is basically evolved to become a means for males to achieve and maintain status. Okay, and that was the form it took in our evolutionary background. Okay, so through aggression, the males got uh, to become the ringleaders. They got to become the leaders. And they got all the perks and stats that came from that. Okay, so if you had aggression in your if you had the aggressive kinds of genes, you'd be more likely to use it on others, okay? And that would allow you to achieve and maintain the status, and also allow you to basically pass on your genes, okay? You got more, if you're a male, you got more, you were able to, impregnate more women, okay? You were able to basically uh, take, aggress against lesser people who might not show your lesser in the status hierarchy, who might not share your genes. And so uh, aggression became basically men who had this kind of motivation and achieved this, okay, they pass on their genes, and so we have men in general having these kinds uh, of instinctual kinds of qualities associated with physical aggression to being more likely, because it allows for this stuff to happen. Now, for women, females place higher value on protecting their own lives from an evolutionary point of view, and we see this passed on, in order to protect their offspring. Okay, so you want to protect your own life, okay, because you need to protect your offspring, okay. So the women who would be less likely to jump into the fray physically and get themselves killed, okay, women who would instead engage in indirect aggression, which is safer for them, would be more likely to survive, pass on their genes. Okay, so there's an evolutionary account for gender differences between men and women. Okay, now of course, as we know, there's tons of other kinds of reasons from a cultural and society and socialization standpoint for why these differences exist. Okay, um, and one of the problems that evolutionary psychology has, okay, is a nice broad basis. It is a partial explanation, right? But it doesn't really account for the great historical and cultural diversity of human aggression, which we saw earlier when we see about nonviolent versus more violent cultures. Um, but so the idea is that evolutionary factors are very compatible and complementary with the social, the cultural, the socialization factors that push us to behave aggressively or non-aggressively. Okay, Now, what about genes, hormones in the brain? Okay, is an aggressive personality type due to the genes? Okay, well, actually, there is individual differences. Okay, in um, there are individual differences in terms of how much aggression. Okay, people are seem predisposed to engage in. Okay, and about one third to almost a half of the variation of aggression in children can be explained from the basis of inheritance. Okay, okay, goes along family lines. Okay, so that's quite a bit. Okay, so there are lots of individual differences in terms of our of the aggressive orientation of people. Okay, strength of the relationship varies based on type of aggression. So, for example, when we look at violent forms of aggression, okay, um, people who engage in a lot of reactive kinds of aggression, okay, reactions like anger and things like that. That's where the genetic component seems to be particularly strong, okay, because it's tied in with temperament, okay. And our temperament that we have, are the characteristic ways that we react emotionally and things like that, is something that has a pretty big inheritance factor. Okay, so there is some relationship between the genes, of course, and aggression in that sense. Um, what about the role of testosterone? Okay, this is a common referral that people make, uh, a common reference to testosterone that people often make in terms of how aggressive, particularly physically aggressive, okay, people are, and this whole idea that men tend to be more aggressive, and if we've seen that's true in terms of physical aggression than women. Okay, so is that biological factor uh, having to do with individual differences in testosterone level? Okay, uh, something that influences aggression? Well, there was a lot of research, not a lot, but there was a substantial interest in this topic, particularly with regard to testosterone. Okay, um, back in the oh, back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, so when there was a lot of work that was being done on the role of this hormone. Okay, so and there was a number of studies that tended to show that high levels of testosterone, and particularly among men, was associated with a greater propensity to aggression. Okay, particularly physical. Okay. However, subsequent research, as time went on, kind of led to a weakening of this kind of conclusion. Okay, the research wasn't as later research wasn't so consistent with this point of view of there being this link. Okay, and that the old research had some holes in it. Okay, and a good example I like to give is the idea of the super male syndrome. Okay, which was out there in psychology and in criminology uh, back in the 70s. Okay, um, they basically there is a genetic abnormality that uh, it's relatively rare, okay, but it characterizes some males, and this is the so-called XYY, okay, syndrome, if you will. Okay, the XYY. Some men, okay, have an extra, so on the 23rd pair of chromosomes, okay, you have the X chromosome or a Y chromosome. If it's a pair, if it's XX, you're a woman, okay, you're female, okay. If it's XY, you have a Y chromosome instead of second X, okay, you're you're that defines a male. Okay, genetically defines a male. Okay, some men, again, it's rare. Okay, have this abnormality that they have an extra Y chromosome, so they're XYY. Okay, so that so whatever goes along with the being male, and testosterone would be one aspect of that. If you're XYY, you're going to have a lot of this. Okay, you're going to have more testosterone, um, and you're also likely to be to be larger. You're likely to be somewhat more muscular, have more male, if you will, qualities. Okay, because you've got an increased level of hormonal kind of male response going on. So what what researchers in uh, discovered was that so you could sort of say that if you're XYY, you're a super male. Okay, that's a term. And the proportion of prison inmates in there for violent kinds of crimes, okay, was much higher, okay, than in the general population. That is, you had a much higher percentage of the males in prison um, uh, for violent crimes, okay, um, were XYY than in the general population. So that led to the idea that, oh, well, then so more testosterone, it's going to make them more prone to aggression, right? Okay, okay. Of course, it's a correlation, right? Okay. But this was the thinking, okay? Testosterone basically, you have more of it, you're more aggressive. So super males tend to be more prone to aggression and in turn toward crime, okay? Well, it turns out that that research was flawed, okay, because it was really based on correlational data, looking at the percentage of super males who are in prison, okay, so prison super male correlation, okay, but it was a correlation, okay, and so what ultimately is discovered is that well, super males XYYs, okay, they tend to be larger, they tend to have they tend to have physical qualities which attract attention, okay, and also basically lead to responses of others that you know have effects on the on the personality development, okay, because you're reacted to in certain ways. People feel more threatened by you, okay. You don't get as much if you're a super male uh, uh, reinforcement. You're sometimes challenged more. You get away with more, okay. Um, you're not as attractive in some ways, so you don't you don't get the kinds of perks that beauty sometimes provides. So all these things in the socialization of super male children, okay, sort of lead them to develop more aggressive kinds of personalities, okay. So the testosterone per se isn't the cause, okay. Um, it's the coinciding of the testosterone appearance. Okay. Also, super males tend not to be as intelligent. Okay. They tend to not score as well or do as well in school for either socialization reasons or because of the syndrome itself. Okay. So they might be more likely to, shall we say, stupidly commit violent crimes and end up in jail. So we have all these other variables going into it, and it turns out it wasn't the testosterone. Okay, is my point here. Okay. But it is the case that most recent research suggests that high testosterone and having low cortisol levels, okay, does predict aggression, okay. Uh, and interestingly, not so much in terms of physical violent aggression, but in the context of seeking status, being you're out there to win and get status, whatever, no matter what, okay, and being dominant, okay, seeking dominance, okay. So there is this connection, okay, but you've got to have the low cortisol uh, uh, hormonal quality as well. Okay, brain and executive functioning, okay. Well, executive functioning, you know, the cognitive abilities and the processes that allow people to plan or inhibit their reactions, okay. Well, highly aggressive people, people that engage in a lot of aggression, okay, tend to have a uh, to be poor, poorer at executive functioning. Okay, they aren't. These abilities do not seem to be the ability to inhibit on the basis of thinking something through. Okay, for example, tend to be lacking. Okay, so there is this link between poor executive functioning and high aggression. Okay. Um, So there's also a lot of variety. We won't get into the details of the kinds of brain activities that tend to relate to aggression. You can read more a little about that in the textbook. Okay, but so executive functioning. Okay, so what the whole idea is. So what kinds of processes get triggered in teens that have a lot of aggression and teens that have less. Okay, and you see this variance associated with the amount of executive functioning uh, going on. Okay, so what we have seen so far is basically a look at how the genes and biology might be tied in with this mystery of human aggression and how prevalent it is in some, less so in others. Okay, um, now let's turn to uh, move away from the genetics and the biology and the evolutionary factors. Okay, and move into learning. Okay, and learning may be a bigger deal. Okay, even than what we've seen so far. Okay, aggressive behavior strongly affected by learning. I'm sure you're not surprised. Okay, aggression can be positively as well as negatively reinforced. Okay, so for example, positive reinforcement. You behave a person behaves with aggression, gets desired outcomes. Okay, so the response leads to a reward, a positive outcome. So the bully gets the lunch money, as the example as we've seen. Okay, the warring nation takes over the disputed territory. So, in our current situation in 2022, you know, if Russia, basically the warring nation, uh, prevails and is able to either take over Ukraine or take over some of their territory, okay, they've been reinforced. Okay, they've gotten a positive reinforcement for their, you know, horribly aggressive behavior. Okay, negative reinforcement, so that aggression can prevent or stop something something you don't want to happen from happening. Okay, aggression prevents or stops undesirable outcomes. So, someone's a whistleblower in a company. The whistleblower gets beaten up by thugs hired by the company, if you will. Okay, and the whistleblower withdraws the complaint. Okay, so this bad thing was going to happen from the company's point of view. Okay, but you engage in aggression, and so it doesn't happen. Okay, you get reinforced for beating up the whistleblower. The pitcher brushes back the batter. The batter is more tentative at the plate, gets no hits. Okay, so once again, that's negative reinforcement. The aggression, okay, brushing back the batter with a potential beanball, okay, uh, led to prevented something you didn't want to happen from happening. It prevented the batter from getting a hit. Okay, So, so we're not always reinforced this way for our aggression, okay? But it happens enough so that, aggressive kinds of orientations and inclinations uh, stay prevalent in social life because there are these maintaining stimuli out there in which there's enough reinforcement occasionally for aggression that the aggressive kind of responses persist. Okay. So a big aspect of, so that's reward and punishment. Okay. Then we can look at observational learning. Okay. Social learning theory. Okay. We learn from the examples of others as well as from direct experience with rewards and punishments. Okay. So observational learning has been studied for many, many years, and it's going to uh, it plays a big role as we talk about media effects later on in this. I think it's going to be a pair of narrations. Okay, so beginning with Bandura's famous study, Bobo doll studies, where he, you know, you know, gave children opportunities to play with various toys, including a Bobo doll. Okay, a big 4 foot high uh, doll that you punch it, you knock it around, and it comes right back up at you, right? The Bobo doll. An inflatable doll. Okay, so he found that he had kids watching um, adults or other children, okay, particularly adults, okay, beating up on the Bobo doll, calling it names, and just being this engaging in this aggressive kinds of behaviors, both verbal and physical. Okay, he found that observing the adult model doing it led to a real marked increase in the extent to which the kids played in kind of in a very violent manner, imitated basically the adult. Okay, and so he found that it was particularly likely to be the case when actually the adult was kind of reinforced for it. Okay, people said, "Yeah, beat up on that doll," yeah, and so on. So the more reinforcement, the more the kids imitated. Okay, learned observationally. Okay, and then when they were given the opportunity to uh, play with the doll alone, okay, as I said, they engaged in this same kind of play. Whereas in the control group, the play wasn't nearly as violent and aggressive. Okay, when the kids didn't observe the aggressive role model. I said reinforcement of the model, okay, increased it, okay, increases observational learning, but it wasn't necessary. The observational learning occurred even when, okay, the kids, the model was just observed and the model was not reinforced, okay. Now, if the model was punished, okay, um, for that. They was criticized. Other person stop doing that. It's um, the that would basically inhibit the kids from behaving aggressively toward the Bobo doll when that Punisher was present. Okay, but if the Punisher left, okay, so the aggressive behavior occurred. Okay, so the punishment for it stopped the kids' behavior, but didn't prevent them from learning it and doing it, behaving in this kind of violent, aggressive way when it was safe to do so for them. Okay, and then there's been like a gazillion lab studies of modeling aggression. Okay, and then we get to the real world of media. Okay, lots and lots of studies of people watching another person, for example, um, deliver unnecessary electric shock in what they thought was like a learning experiment. They could have used other means to teach, okay, the uh, uh, the learner, okay, in this kind of fabricated lab study. But observing a prior subject, really a Confederate, behaving in this aggressive way made people more likely to pick aggression, okay, delivering harmful, painful electric shots as a means of teaching the person, than choosing other methods, okay. There's tons of studies, okay, and then there's the real world of media, which this all will connect back to. Okay, so basically, models who use aggression to obtain desired goals and are not punished for their behavior are most likely to increase aggression among observers. So, we see that watching aggressive models can lead to more, can lead the observer, okay, to learn the aggressive behavior and be more likely to engage in it. Okay? And it can do more. Okay? So, yeah, learn specific aggressive behaviors, develop more favorable attitudes and beliefs about aggression in general, okay? And to be more likely to construct aggressive scripts about what is the appropriate response in a given situation that you're observing. Um, is it aggression? Okay, that can become one of the scripts that people can learn to respond to a situation or a type of situation with. Okay, you learn, um, that if this happens, then and that happens, then maybe aggression is the appropriate response. Is following through with the script. Okay, so there's all these attitudinal and cognitive responses in addition to just learning the aggressive behavior itself. Okay. Now, non-aggressive models can decrease aggressive behavior. Okay. All right. Socialization, cultural differences. Okay. So, we coming back. So now we've been through biology and genes. Okay. Through learning. Okay. Now let's look a little bit more at learning in a broader context, cultural learning. So socialization of aggression, it varies across cultures. So for example, there's cultural differences in machismo, okay? So basically, some cultures basically uh, place greater value, and particularly the males tend to become more, to engage in more machismo. Okay, they basically, engage in that kind of, well, you know what it is, kind of like strutting a bit and being somewhat threatening in one's voice, basically taking the, uh, you know, uh, being really manly about it, the macho man. Okay. There's differences in cultures in terms of how much the macho man image is something that's valued. Okay, it's clearly related to aggression. Okay, but from culture to culture, it's endorsed or encouraged or characteristic of that culture more or less. Okay, now related to machismo, okay, is the culture of honor. Okay, the culture of honor. Okay, here the emphasis is placed on honor and status, particularly for males, and the role of aggression in protecting that honor. Okay, so what we'll see with the culture of honor, okay, is that in cultures of honor, okay, even minor conflicts or disputes are often seen as challenges to social status and to reputation, and can therefore trigger aggressive responses. Okay, well, we'll get back to that in a second. Now, we'll go to here. So I notice here the Southern culture of honor. Okay, so the culture of honor, okay, is actually a historically, historians talk a lot about it as to people. Uh, Basically, the culture of honor kind of ethos, okay, uh, in the United States, okay, actually comes um, uh, from Scotland, Ireland, the Scotch-Irish immigrants who came to this country and settled in a particular way. Now, the Scotch-Irish culture of northern England and southern Scotland and Ireland, okay, they were they basically were herding cultures, okay. And herding cultures, basically, you have herds of sheep, cattle, whatever, okay, involve a lot, you've got your land and your herds are your property, okay? And threats to that, okay, um, basically are threats to one's livelihood. So this whole element of protecting one's property and culture, I'm sorry, protecting one's property and basically really became kind of primo um, in the Scotch-Irish cultures of honor. Okay, and so to be threatened either by your property or by what you are, what you have, who your people are. Okay, threats. Okay, were basically met with a lot of uh, you know threats, a lot of aggression. Okay, a lot of when people got angry, when they felt insulted, when they felt a threat to them or their surrounding culture. Okay, they were likely to respond with aggressive impulses. Okay, uh, and as one know, you might not know this, but there was like hundreds of years of war. Okay, that went on just in northern England, southern in Scotland, and so on and so forth, with people kind of protecting their little subcultures within the larger realm. Okay, well, that culture of honor basically has evolved, developed. Okay, and what we see is as people who come from that cultural background emigrated to the United States, they tend to settle in kind of an arc. Okay, like basically migrated, from the coast through Pennsylvania and then into Appalachia. Okay, and the southern state, Tennessee, Kentucky, all these southern states, rural states. Okay, that's where the culture of honor really took hold because of the pattern of immigration of people who came from culture of honor societies. Okay, um, and so what we see is that the culture of honor is much more prevalent in Appalachia and in the American South. Okay, than it is in the North, the Northeast, and so on. Okay, so Northerners and Southerners, on average, differed relatively dramatically in terms of their um, indoctrination, if you will, socialization into a culture of honor. Northerners, not so much. Southerners, more likely to have been the case. So, back in the 90s, a group of researchers at the University of Michigan did some really very interesting research studying this. Okay, they studied now the University of Michigan. It draws students from all over the country, all over the world. Okay, so the researchers were able to identify students who were coming from the South. Okay, the southern states. Okay, or northern states like New York, like Massachusetts, Connecticut, uh, and and other northern states, Michigan, Minnesota, and so on, where culture of honor is not so prevalent. Okay, so they studied these students. Okay, and they put them in scenarios, kind of interesting and somewhat amusing. Okay, where they would insult. Okay, in a subtle way. Okay, um, a southern student, and they're all males. Okay, or a northern student in the same way. Okay, and normally these students don't differ much at all in terms of their propensity toward aggression in a normal kind of situation. Okay, but the researchers predicted that Southern men, okay, college students, would be more likely to respond with aggression to an insult, okay, than would Northern students, males, okay. So they have this study where basically the student, the male student, signs up for the experiment. He's either a northern or a southerner. Does some stuff in one room, okay, and now is told, okay, the second part of the study is gonna take place in this other room down the hall. Okay, so you need to go there now, and the experimenter will catch up with you, and we'll proceed from there. So everybody gets that instruction, and basically, um, the insult comes as the person is walking down the hall. Okay, uh, there's another person, okay, who is sort of in the, it's a narrow hallway, okay, sort of in the way, okay, comes further toward that person, and as they pass each other, okay, the 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 Confederate, this other person is a Confederate, kind of leans in a little bit in a very subtle way, so as they nudge shoulders as they're passing each other by. The Confederate is trained that as he walks by, under his breath, he says, if you'll pardon the French, asshole. Okay, he basically insults him this way. Okay, not directly, but there's the insult. Okay, and it's audible. Okay. Now, in virtually all the cases, the person just keeps walking, going the rest of the experiment. Okay, but now, how is the psyche, okay, of the student, okay, who's now been insulted this way, called an asshole, um, affected? Okay, so what they do in the next part of the study, they take various kinds of tests. They give them various kinds of exercises. They take some physiological measures to look for the evidence of whether or not has this instilled anger and a propensity to aggress differently in the northern than in the southern students. Okay, so that's the gist of these studies. Okay, so here is some of the results. Okay, so so we have and by the way, it makes a difference, somewhat of a difference, whether the insult is privately, nobody else heard you, being insulted, or whether the insult is public. Okay, it was audible to others. Okay, that does have an effect. These studies, it doesn't explain all the effect, but so here these studies only involve just insult, as I've described. But if we look at the control condition, okay, we look at the northern participants, we look at the southern participants. So basically, they are in the second part of the experiment. They undergo this evaluation. Okay, they answer various kinds of questions, and there's an evaluator. Okay, and they're asked, so how do you think this other person that's evaluating you is going to evaluate you? Okay, and so one of the responses that they asked for is, how would the evaluator rate your masculinity? Okay, and as you can see, it doesn't have much. Control versus insult, public insult, doesn't have much of an effect at all. Okay, on Northerners. But look what happens with the Southerners. Okay, now they think, they're in a whole different situation. They've been insulted. Okay, that's all that's happened. That happened in the past, just a few minutes ago. But they're now imagining that another person evaluating them sees them as less masculine. Okay, so they've been threatened. They have this in their mind. They've been threatened, and they now they're perceiving that others are perceiving them as, not very manly. Okay, here's the percentage change in testosterone level. Okay, Okay, so let's look at what happened. Northerners, you're insulted versus the control, virtually no impact, okay, a little bit. But if you're a southern man, okay, then if you're insulted, your testosterone level shoots up. Okay, the insult happened, 10, 15 minutes ago, but look at it's activated the testosterone. Okay, in another study, uh, they have another uh, uh, another Confederate. Okay, not the one that insulted them. Okay, but another one. Okay, and we look at how close. Okay, um, as they're now going the other way, and there's another Confederate in the hallway. How close do they get? Okay, as they pass. Well, not much of an effect on the Northerners, but on the Southerners, well, okay, you see they keep that respectable, Southern hospitality distance, okay, in the control condition, okay, more distance than the Northerners, okay, that's interesting, but that's your Southern hospitality kind of thing, okay. But if they've been insulted, they're in the face of the Confederate. Okay, they get really close to the Confederate as they pass by, a sign of basically a sort of uh, a sign of aggression, if you will. Okay, so we see that depending on the culture you're from, you respond to insult. Okay, differently in terms of how aggressive your response is going to be. So that's a wonderful example of the culture. I don't say wonderful, but it's a good example of the southern of how culture can affect reactions, aggressive reactions. In this case, to insult. Now, keep in mind, on average, these guys don't show any differences. Okay, it's only in the insult conditions that we see the divergence of the southern and the northern um, college students. All right. So here's another study. Okay. So here's a study in which a culture in which there's a lot of culture of honor. Okay. Famously, okay, is Chile. Okay, Chile, the culture of honor is kind of an aspect of their broader culture, particularly among males. Okay, so basically, this study had Chilean men, okay, and Canadian men, okay, giving their reactions to various kinds of scenarios that they vignettes that they were asked to hear about, to read about. Okay, and basically it involves um, the kind of vignette involves, okay, um, a man, okay, it's in a couple, okay, reacting with aggression, okay, domestic violence toward his wife, toward his spouse, okay, um, and what they've learned is that this male's reaction, okay, this domestic violence that went on with this man, okay, aggressing against his wife, uh, came up out of a spat about was a spat about some sort of uh, situation that didn't involve anything that would smack of jealousy. I think it was about having made you know spent some money on something that should not have, and not have consulted, and so on and so forth. And you look at, so how acceptable was this violence? Okay, and you can see that for both the Chilean and the Canadian men, okay, there's not much difference between them in terms of how acceptable they thought this violent act of the husband was. Okay. or they were given a story, okay, that the whole thing, this whole argument that led to this domestic violence came up because the wife had been flirting with another man at a party, okay, which of course triggered jealousy, okay, in the husband and the abuser, okay. But you can see that the big difference here is that the Chileans, the men, tend to see this as more acceptable now that, compared to the non-jealousy situation, is more acceptable, this violence, this aggression, okay, um, if it involved jealousy, uh, which of course is a threat to the man's honor. His wife is flirting openly with this other man at a party, threat to the honor. So it's acceptable, more acceptable, that form of violence, okay? The Canadian students or men were not affected at all by whether it was a jealousy or non-jealousy, okay? So we look at this thing, this bar here, we see how when there was a culture, when there was honor involved, okay, the aggression is seen as more acceptable. That's characteristic of the culture of honor. Okay, how are we doing on time here? Okay, so at this point, I am going to uh, stop this, end this narration, and begin another one. Okay, because this one's gotten is already well over an hour. Okay, so we've talked about, we've gone through learning. Okay, up through learning and how culture affects it. Now we're going to move into some other aspects, the frustration aggression hypothesis, and then we'll talk about media, but we'll do that in a subsequent narration. Okay.